I'm Barrie Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barrie.
Welcome to Back Barries, a podcast from Guardian Australia. Well, the impact of the Iran war is becoming clearer for all to see. The lack of a clear strategy, the lack of clear objectives, the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz, which has caused all sorts of difficulties, and as a result, the economic cost threatening the global economy. The government is now talking out loud about an inflation rate above 5%, maybe softening up the country for more increases in interest rates, and all the while, petrol in a lot of places now is reaching $2.50 a litre where you can get it. So that's the wash-up after 3 weeks of a war that the government and the opposition supported, but it turns out most of you, the people of Australia, did not. There was a Resolve poll that showed only 28% of Australians supported the war. In other words, only 28% supported the government's endorsement, Tony.
Yeah, I was actually surprised it was that high, and I think it was interesting that Hastie is sort of starting to distance himself between the Trumpian view of the world, which I think is really interesting. We might come back to that later. But Trump is just stepping on his own landmines now, and it's going to be interesting because there are still some notionally intelligent people who think Trump is playing this sort of 5D chess, and the rest of us are playing checkers. But I think the last week has shown that this guy is completely out of his depth. And when he comes up against international political heavyweights like Netanyahu and Putin, they play him off a break, is what I've noticed. But he's awful to his friends. The Japanese Prime Minister, I thought those comments where she was in the Oval Office with him and he talked about Pearl Harbor. And
you want a surprise? What about Pearl Harbor? That was a surprise. Yeah.
He wouldn't talk like that to Putin. But it's now obvious that, he's been played off a break. He's now set course on this path, and none of us know where it ends and what the end looks like.
It's the author Geraldine Brooks wrote a piece for the Nine newspapers during the week, and I think a lot of what she said would pick up on that the sentiment that's expressed in that poll, that she gave Albanese the benefit of the doubt in his dealings with Trump up until this point. But now with this war, with no legal basis, no clear objective, she just thinks it's reached that point where you wonder what is going on. You talk about Netanyahu being he's shrewd. There's no doubt about that. The way that he had launched that attack on a key facility, the biggest facility, energy facility in Iran, and I don't think it bothered him one little bit about the argument that followed about whether America was notified or whether they needed their permission or not. And the best Trump could come up with was, well, he said he won't do it again. It's done. It's like the sense that they would walk away from this and saying, well, an 86-year-old is dead and therefore, we win. Mm. It's the experience with Hamas is, the dead, like Hamas fighters, become martyrs and the rest of them fight on. And so I think that was probably obvious a week or two ago, but what is now obvious is the Strait of Hormuz. That Trump has not got the answers, and he found himself isolated when he looked for support. Yeah.
I suspect there will be a coalition of the unwilling in the end. I know that a lot of countries have said they're not going to get involved in it, but I think ultimately, they've got us over a barrel, pun unintended, because if we want to open up, those energy supplies, other countries are going to probably have to get involved, I suspect. And I see there's been a bit of movement from other international leaders now who originally rejected his overtones, but it's going to be very difficult to navigate in terms of global economic consequences. And, we're reaching that point where, the ramifications could continue for years.
It was, I think that the German Chancellor put it best. He probably echoed most of the sentiments around the world, because this is a country, the United States and Donald Trump, who boast, we have the most powerful military in the world. There's nothing that we can't do. And then suddenly he's going cap in hand looking for support to keep a strait open. The German Chancellor says there was never a joint decision to intervene. The Iranian regime must come to an end, but based on all experiences going back decades, bombing it into submission is not the right approach. And his defence minister said, this is not our war. We have not started it. I'm sure that's a popular view, and a lot of people would be saying, just ordinary citizens in the street were saying, well, you started it. If you haven't got the might to deal with it, And as for the coalition of the unwilling, it may come to that in a way, but I don't think too many of them will put their hardware and their ships in harm's way, and certainly not their troops.
It'll be purely on economic motivations. Certainly no allegiance to America or any trust in Donald Trump, who I think has obliterated that with middle-ranking powers and his allies, more generally speaking. So the trick will be in terms of, when you're talking about what does the end look like. I think for Iran, one of the golden rules of politics, whether it be domestic or international, is to give a pathway back for your opponents. So they can do a strategic retreat. And in the case of Iran, if they've got nothing to lose, they'll just go scorched earth, which they're actually in the process of doing, and they'll just blow up all the supply chains for energy, and they'll massive ramifications for the economy, which Trump doesn't seem to have thought ahead. And that is I think, when it comes to how does Trump engineer it so that Iran reaches some sort of settlement and opens up these energy sources. The only real offering will have to include Israel, because that's their true enemy. And I can't see any realistic offering that Trump can give them that involves Israel.
Yeah, and he's got to get their approval ahead of time. Look, just sticking with me on this one, but I was just reading a book, Ian Fleming's biography, the author of the Bond books during the week for a book club. There was quite a few references in that to the Suez crisis in 1956, when Fleming was involved in espionage and so on for the British government. It struck me that there were some remarkable comparisons and similarities between that and the Strait of Hormuz now. The most striking is that it was led by Britain with Israel support when they invaded Egypt, because Egypt wanted to nationalise the canal, opposed by the UN and opposed by the US. And now you get this situation 70 years later. The Strait of Hormuz is the reverse. You've got America again with Israel, against the UN, and effectively against Britain's view, certainly not getting the support that they want from Britain. So it's the reverse of that. But what's really interesting about it is that Australia, both times, was on the wrong side of history. We supported Britain when they were fading. They were humiliated by what went on in the Suez Canal. But we still saw them as a traditional ally, and we needed to be by them. And now again, the United States is losing all credibility around the world at a time when we're sticking with them on this one, against Europe, against the better judgment of most of those in Europe. It just seems to me, it's 70 years on, and that when you get the reverse situation. I wonder why then it is that the media pretty much leaves the government alone. They're having a go at them over the handling of the petrol crisis, and the economy is going to be a big one. But on the fact that they backed the United States so early in the piece, not much. And I think it's partly because the media is still using a kind of an old-fashioned prism. If the major parties, if the coalition and Labor are at odds, it's controversial, it's an issue, they go for it. If they are in agreement, not so much. And I think that's out of date, because only about 50% of Australians now support those major parties anyway. That's another 50% that have got a view around this, and I pretty much know where that view would sit. It just seems that that they've got to break out of that kind of attitude, that it's not a story unless the major parties are in conflict.
Yeah, and I think Hastie is picking up on this. He distanced himself from Trump. He's been talking about self-sufficiency for a long time, and Chris Bowen has made an announcement to put more funding into the 2 existing refineries in operation in Australia. And that feeds into that narrative about being self-sufficient, which has been more pronounced in our research ever since COVID. But I think Hastie, this is the unorthodoxy of Hastie, and I reckon if Albanese, after the election, obviously he would have been feeling supremely confident about his campaign abilities and his political skills, rightly so, 94 seats, and breaking a lot of records along the way. I think his first choice for opposition leader, he would have preferred Angus Taylor. Good CV, but a guy in a suit, nothing different about that. I think Susan Lee would have been his second preference. And I think Hastie his least preferred option.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Because he's just unorthodox. I think Albanese would absolutely back himself against Hastie, undoubtedly, for the confidence that he's got at the moment. But he would know that with Hastie there is, and I say this very carefully so I don't be sued for defamation, but he's got a bit of that Latham around him. The Latham pre-2004.
Too late, mention Latham. I'll sue you.
But it's that unorthodoxy, that total unorthodoxy where, Latham had Howard at sixes and sevens, by making announcements and started dictating the flow.
And it changed the whole superannuation system for politicians, Latham, from opposition.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, Hastie is not coming out with the orthodox approach to these things, and he's recognising that Trump is not popular in Australia. He's recognising that Australians want to see more self-sufficiency, and he hasn't been afraid to take on Trump in the same way that Mark Carney in Canada, really got hairy-chested with him as well.
Yeah, speaking of Canada, and I was talking about what happened with the Suez all those years ago, 70 years ago, Canada was chosen to lead the sort of negotiations to bring peace in that conflict. And he phoned the British Prime Minister and he said to him that if you don't get out of Egypt, we'll get out of the Commonwealth. Now, that's Canada.
Yeah.
and they're a bit like that again.
Yeah.
Even now, they haven't lost that characteristic. What Hastie said, of course, was he accused Trump of being petulant. Now, that's something that no member of the opposition, they haven't really criticised him in a personal sense in that way before. So it was quite significant. But just before we get to the economy, the other aspect of the war now that the government has to deal with, and that is petrol shortages, the price of petrol, whether people are being ripped off and so on. Chris Bowen, I thought, in the end explained it pretty simply. The proposition is simple enough, that we have the same amount of petrol overall in Australia that we would ordinarily have. There's no change to that. No ships have been blocked. But it's been selling at twice the rate that it normally would. So that's panic buying, right? Andrew Hastie's response to that was, well, here's Chris Bowen blaming you, the people. Well, I thought that was cheap politics, because how do you explain that situation, and it's true, without, in effect, blaming the people who have gone out and bought fuel that, right at the moment anyway, they don't need?
Yep. I filled up with petrol this morning. It was like a scene from Mad Max. It was huge queues and very expensive prices. But I think, we're at the moment in a blame culture, not an excuses culture. People want outcomes, and they're sick of excuses from both parties. And of course, closing down refineries has been basically a bipartisan approach for some time. The last two closed under Abbott, and there's two left. So I think, again, though, Hastie is recognising this play, and he's tapping into that sentiment out there. Yeah.
You talk about the blame game. Within hours, of course, of the Bondi terrorist attack, Albanese was being blamed for it, and there was a willingness on the part of a lot to blame, too early in the piece here anyway, for the government for what's happening with the price of fuel. There will be a close eye kept on it, but basically the strategy now is they've appointed a czar, in effect, somebody to oversee it. And then each state appoints a citizen, not a politician, to liaise with that person, right? So they've kind of handed it to the community, in a sense, to handle it. And I don't think that's just safeguarding themselves from the sort of bulletproofing them for political attacks. I think it kind of makes sense, because they're looking for people who are expert in the field.
Yeah. But the blame culture that we're experiencing right now is precisely why Hanson is polling at 28%.
Yeah, and we'll get to that when we talk about South Australia shortly, and we'll certainly look at how this is impacting on the economy after we take a break. Just before I do, though, I just want to remind you again that we'll be recording Back Barries live at the Sydney Writers' Festival this year on Thursday, May the 21st. I don't think I mentioned this last week, but it's a free event, and you don't need to book either. There's a big space, so you just rock up, you get yourself a coffee, and sit down and take it all in. Back in a moment. Okay, we're back. Well, Jim Chalmers has had some interesting things to say. He's kind of conceded that inflation could go above 5%. He's pretty much declared that the government won't reach its targets on productivity, not for 5 or 6 years. What is he doing here? What's the strategy?
Well, they've opened up the door on a recession, so it looks like they're managing expectations. He is, of course, did his doctorate on Paul Keating, and I couldn't help but think that there was a bit of, the recession we had to have that Paul Keating spoke about. And you were in the middle of it. Talk us through what happened there.
Well, it was I was away overseas with Hawke at the time. I can't recall exactly where we were. I think it might have been a regional forum or something. But the figures had come out to confirm the two consecutive quarterlies to confirm a recession, and it was Keating's task as Treasurer back in the country to articulate it. He was actually at an event, and the phone rang in the kitchen. And it was John Laws calling. He found out where he was speaking. It was in 1990, not a lot of mobile phones, November 1990. And so he went to the kitchen and spoke to John Laws, and he came up with the line that this is the recession we had to have. And he was doing all sorts of things around that. He was kind of saying that we controlling inflation is everything. He didn't say it at the time. He said it afterwards that the Reserve Bank had put interest rates up. They were too slow to react, and when they did react, they overreacted. But what he was doing, I think, was a bit of a wake-up call, not only to the country but to his own Prime Minister and the Cabinet, that time for a bit of tough love politically. And as a result of some of the measures that followed from that, the government or the country did have a sustained period of economic growth. So he was right, but at the time, and I have read some interpretations of this, that he'd run these lines past Hawke. Well, that's not the face I saw when he was briefed.
What was the face that you saw?
on what had just happened. He was furious, right? And I think what his immediate mindset was, because just keep in mind he'd won 4 elections. It was time to go, pretty much. Keating's turn. And it was after the election in 1990 and still Hawke giving no indication that he was going anywhere. So he felt paranoid. Leaders always feel paranoid when they're overseas anyway. They think that when they go away, everybody's scheming behind their backs, and he certainly thought that was happening. And he just couldn't line up the strategy, Keating's strategy, against that kind of paranoia. So initially it wasn't a great response.
Yeah. And what was his, when he came back, how did he deal with it?
Oh, they had the usual one-on-one. At least they had the ability to do that, and they would chat about it. And of course, Keating would have won the argument on logic, that clearly this is what's needed now, because we're in recession, we have to accept it. I don't accept at the moment though that either Jim Chalmers or Anthony Albanese, and maybe not even the governor of the Reserve Bank, are accepting that we'll go into recession on this count. Consider what the situation was back in 1990 when interest rates were at 17% for a home loan. And even though they called it the jobless recovery, because even when the economy did recover, unemployment was in double figures. So it's a different set of circumstances, and I'm not convinced this time that that's where we're headed. But we will, unless action is taken, and the budget's going to have to reflect that. So it was an interesting time in history. But now, back to the present, it's a question, I think, of whether Jim Chalmers is going to have the support that he needs, and that Keating eventually got. The Reserve Bank governor did say, though, asked about the possibility of a recession. It's hard to get inflation down, so we might have to deal with that probably. But it was a bit ambiguous, and I think they're saying that dealing with the kind of overall situation and not accepting that recession lies ahead. What did you make of that comment?
Yeah, I think, again, expectation management. The RBA has been saying for some time that government spending is too high. This is before the Iran war. And Chalmers has been talking about making some tough decisions. There is talk of some tax changes, but I think what economists and the RBA really want to see is reining in government spending. And now, obviously, the Iran war, it is going to have a huge impact on energy costs and supply chains and the ability to manufacture things here in Australia. Or even, fertilizer. It has a lot of products, which is the biggest input for most farmers. Not to mention the freight to get it to market. So it's going to be interesting to see if the Australian public buy that as an excuse for what could be a really rocky economic period, potentially recession. When we were doing research when the Ukraine war hit, inflation was going up a lot. We asked, respondents in all our focus groups, who's to blame for this, Most of them said it was a combination of global events, global inflation around the globe. They did point to Ukraine and disruption of energy supply. There was also a bit of, I don't think the government is making, some of the decisions they need to make. It was a bit of like, all of the above. And to be honest, they were probably quite right in that assessment. I'm not sure they're going to buy the Iran war as an excuse this time. They'll certainly factor it in making things more worse than they should have been. But in all our research, we're seeing, this negative mood sentiment out there. They think the next generation will be worse off than their parents' generation. That was 56%. So I don't see how Albanese and Chalmers slipped that punch.
Yeah, I think it'll be a factor in their minds, surely, because if inflation continues to rise, interest rates go up again, they'll understand that's partly due to the war. But I think the government had already made up its mind anyway before Iran that this was going to be a tough budget and had to be, and that they knew that in this political cycle, this is the time, if there's going to be a bit of political heat and they're going to have to take decisions that a lot of people won't like, now is the time to do that. So this will give them a bit of political cover. I'm not suggesting for a second you'd whistle up this as political cover. You don't want it. It's terrible. But I think it'll be a factor in the background. Now the South Australian election, and we are recording this before the results are in. But the latest polls, the news poll showed that Labor had slipped a bit from 44 primary to 40 over about a month. The Liberals are on 16 and One Nation 24. One Nation 24, Liberals 16. There's the question whether that, if they were to record that kind of primary vote, and that's not a given, but if they were, does that necessarily mean they would have more seats? Because Anthony Green made an interesting point this week when he said that this is probably the first election he can recall when the nation is paying attention to a state election. They're not that interested in who'll come first. They're interested in who'll come second.
Yeah, I think he's nailed that. Because, whilst we're seeing these incredible numbers for One Nation, we don't know how enduring they are. What was interesting to me is news poll said 40% primary for Labor, Malinowskis Labor.
40% the last figure, yeah.
Yeah, and that was his result at the last election. So it's status quo, which is a bloody good effort. However, he was in the 40s. He was in the high 40s for a while. Last poll, as you said, 44% down to 40. I did notice in the last few days he took on Hanson personally, which tells me that their polling is showing them that they have lost a few points to One Nation, or there's a growing cohort of soft Labor voters who are Hanson curious, and he wants to nip that in the bud before it becomes, something of a trend.
And why wouldn't he? Because the Liberals won 13 seats at the last election, and the suggestion is, that it might be single figures. It becomes a contest between One Nation and the Liberals as to who will have the biggest and who can claim to be the official opposition. It wouldn't matter to Malinowskis whether the Liberals win 13 or 7, I wouldn't have thought. And so there was that one line that I thought was quite effective. He said, well, Sunday morning when we wake up, I'll be in South Australia and Pauline Hanson will be in Queensland. Yeah. And he's trying to, I think, there portray One Nation as an imported product coming into South Australia. And it is, to an extent. There's been no real One Nation presence. So that's, I think that was quite a clever line.
Yeah, he's a generational politician, Malinowskis, and he's smart enough to be thinking about next term. He won't be cocky enough to assume he's going to win on Saturday night. He'll be keeping that in check, but I think he intuitively knows he's going to be Premier next week. But he'll be thinking ahead to next term, and will One Nation start eating into their territory more and become a threat with populist economics? So, yeah, I thought very smart play, but it also shows that the smarter people in Labor recognise that none of us knows where this juggernaut is going.
Yeah, but even though Labor has lost a bit of support, it doesn't suggest they'll lose seats to One Nation. I think Anthony Green identified one seat where he's pretty sure that One Nation could finish second and therefore have a shot at beating Labor.
Yep.
But overall, the real contest is One Nation versus the Liberals, really, in the regions, and the Liberals versus Independents in other seats. And if they do lose numbers, it'll be because of that.
Yeah. And obviously, if One Nation records 20%, that'll be incredible. That'll reverberate all the way back to Canberra. However, South Australia is a little bit unique insofar as, for that point I made before, Malinauskas is a political athlete. He was always going to win comfortably before the rise of One Nation, and he's still going to win comfortably after the rise of One Nation. So it needs to be sort of viewed in isolation. It's going to be a very different contest in Victoria where that One Nation vote might come back home.
And there are not a lot of elections where you can do that, where you can record the program before the election result is in and declare that Labor will certainly win the election. But that's the case this time around. Well, that's it for this week. You can write to us at Back Barries, or one word, Back Barries with an IE, at theguardian.com. So that's Back Barries at theguardian.com. And you can also now watch us on YouTube. This podcast was made on the sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri people. It was produced by Daniel Simo. Video production, Burton Nguyen.
The executive producer, Hannah Parks.
I'm Barrie Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barrie, and this is Back Barries, a Guardian Australia podcast.